Jim? All right. Turn me down. Okay, can we turn down the volume, please, to minimum? Thank you. We have 1.5 hours to talk about what's happening with democracy. And I have a great panel here, hand-selected people from literally all over the world, young people and the two of us. So we hope that you will, we're younger in certain ways, I'm quite sure, than the rest. But we were there, we remember when we were so vibrant and energetic as you. And I also rely on your help. The reason why we do these things is because we want to talk together, otherwise TV would suffice, or maybe reading newspapers. So really do fructify the fact that we are here to talk with each other. Now, democracy has all these sort of question marks, but it's the only game in town. Seems like nobody's come up with anything better than democracy. There's not even a talk of anything fundamentally different. Now, democracy, like capitalism, has many shapes and shades. Capitalism here in this country 20 years ago, in the early 90s, looked completely different than capitalism today, but it's still capitalism. 30 years ago, we did not know that we're destroying this planet at this pace. We didn't know that we're so powerful as to be harmful, not just to ourselves, but to our immediate surroundings. We didn't know that, and then capitalism changed. I'd like to hear your opinion. Of course, I here represent European. We have another sort of European, United Kingdom.
Still European.
You're European, not so united, but European nevertheless. Can you just say 2 sentences about what do you do, and briefly introduce yourself, but really just 2 sentences would suffice.
Yeah.
Please.
I'm from Venezuela. Just now I'm a student of journalism, and I am activist for democracy at an organization that we have in Spain. I live just now in Spain to promote a new way of leadership in my country since from the other part of the world.
Daniel, thank you very much. Please.
Hello everyone, my name is Narayana Sharma from Zimbabwe. I am an activist and also an artist. I work with girls and young women, and I push for women's issues.
Hi everyone, my name is Mete Coban. I've got a few different hats on. I'm a councillor for a place called Stoke Newington in Hackney. If you haven't been, I recommend you to go if you ever visit London. I also run a charity called My Life, My Say, which is on a mission to secure a better Brexit for young people, and we run the all-party parliamentary group on a better Brexit for young people. And I used to also work for the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, leading his youth engagement in the run-up to his election in last year.
Seems like we'll be needing translation from English to English for you.
Yeah.
You have to be a little bit less cockney.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Me, you all know, I suppose.
I'm very intercultural and global because I was born in Iran. I grew up in France. I have Canadian citizenship. I teach in India. I'm the director of the Mahatma Gandhi Center for Peace. I'm a political philosopher, so you make your choice.
Nice.
Nice. And I've been in prison in Iran, so as a public intellectual. So yeah, typically the global Democrat
will also play some role in your
absolutely
in your strategic placement of yourself.
Yes, since I came to first Forum 2000. Actually, it was not Forum 2000 at the time. When I was a student in 1990, I came from Paris. Václav Havel actually invited a lot of public intellectuals, and as a student, I was there as the youngest, actually.
Sitting in one of those places?
No, it didn't function this way. Okay. Actually, it was mixed.
So you see, there is a certain career procedure also when it comes to Forum 2000.
Yes, yes.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Please.
Hi, I'm Zuzana Vova, and I'm from the Czech Republic. I'm the Czech youth delegate to the United Nations, and I try to strengthen the participatory channels for youth on the global level, and also on the local and national level. We try to improve the civic participation of our youth.
Perfect. And last participant, you can all see there's an empty chair, and that empty chair is there for a reason. That empty chair belonged to this gentleman who couldn't make it because he got imprisoned exactly for his political activities, and we want to make sure that he is with us, at least in the form of absence. So who's the youngest? You are.
Me. I'm
Okay.
20.
You're 20. Good. So is democracy? Is democracy too young to die and too old to rock and roll?
I think that it may be a prejudice. I think that it might be all the opposite. I think that it's never too late to practice democracy, but it's every time more important to start since young people, to start before than the other people that precede us. Because in this way, we may help our countries. For example, I'm from Venezuela, and just now in my country, there is a state of a man. There is no state of law. So we are very moved by the opposite people and from the new ways of protest to help to get a new way of governors or new governors, that it's our fight just now. And in the way that the young people start to participate at the protests, at the doing activism, we may arrive before to our objective.
Okay. What does democracy mean for you, actually?
It's a very difficult word because it has a lot of applications in the case in which you try to think it. But just now, I think that democracy is this kind of way to everyone can participate and everyone can decide what's doing at your country. And in this way, you can take the rights of your country to help the people that it's around of you.
So now I'd like to ask the one who's been youngest for the longest time. What is democracy for you? How do you, when somebody says that that's not democratic, is it just a way of getting to power? What is democracy in the sort of the broadest meaning of the word?
Well, I think that most of the time we confuse between the theory and the practice of democracy. Since you were mentioning rock and roll, actually, I think that democracy is like the Beatles, it's never old. It depends how you listen to it. I mean, that's the way you want to live it, you want to defend it. And actually, it goes back to the general title of our conference, which is, it's two sides, actually. It's strengthening democracy and in uncertain times. Now, when it's related to young people, I think that it's all about how democracy is, we can ask the question like this: is democracy still an ideal for young people today as it used to be for people who got out of the Second World War against totalitarian regimes? For them, certainly in Europe and elsewhere in America, democracy was an ideal. For those who were fighting against Stalinism, democracy was an ideal. Today, in many places outside, actually, Europe, I would say, Western Europe, like in the Middle East or in Latin America, democracy is still an ideal. And this is very important. So I think that we need to talk about the heritage of democracy. And that's when you ask me, is democracy still living? Yes, still we have to talk about Athenian democracy up to now. But it's all about how we can perceive it as the younger generations, about the history of democracy. I feel that democracy needs young people as young people need democracy. But it's all about, is democracy still an ideal for them if they go and vote or if they are disengaged? So we have to speak about a civic disengagement of young people in today's Western democracies, which is not the case everywhere around the world. Actually, we saw it in the first panel today. They were saying that in many places of the world, young people actually, they fight in the name of democracy against dictatorships. So I think we can start on this level.
Should younger people than 18 be allowed to vote? What do you think, Susanna? You think it would be good if we could vote from, let's say, 16, like in Austria?
So in Austria, you can vote from the age of 16. In some countries, there is the voting age set at 17. I actually had a conversation with Czech students about this, and while the majority of them complained that their voices are not heard, they were also vehemently against being able to vote from the age of 16, because they said when you see such an apathy, such a political apathy already among people who are 18, it will not necessarily change if you just decrease the voting age. So I do not have an opinion on it. I believe that it could work. In Austria, for example, the 16-year-olds vote in higher numbers than the 18-year-olds. But I also believe that it has to be coupled with a very strong civic outreach, the understanding why it's important to vote, why it's so important to participate, and not leave it to the older generations to decide for you.
Talking about leaving, was it a big debate around Brexit that young people were, was it like a thing that you debated in pubs?
Yeah, I mean, since the referendum and during the referendum as well, I think one of the things that have changed in the UK is that a lot of young people have been more engaged in politics. So in Scotland, where you had the Scottish referendum, it politicised the generation. And Brexit was that for young people, particularly in England, where it caused so many divisions and so much debate because it created people, it sort of triggered people's minds to start thinking about what sort of future they want to live in, whether they want to, you know, better job security, better housing, or whatever it is. And Brexit was that. So I think since to answer to your question, I think since the referendum, there's been much more engagement. And in the last election, it went up from 46%, and it's reported to be between 60 to 72% the turnout, but also taking into consideration that since when the general election was called in April 2017, we had 2 million young people who registered to vote. So not only there's been an increase of 20% of turnout, there's also been an increase in the voter registration, and that's because wherever you go to in the UK right now, there is a lot of question marks that needs to be answered, and a lot of people are starting to think about it. But among other reasons, which you also need politicians to inspire young people to go out and vote. But it's interesting, just want to quickly come to Susanna's point. I don't want to take too much time. But I think, you know, a lot of studies do show that if you do engage young people at a younger age, so you can even go to earlier years, there's some interesting projects in the UK right now with Lego Foundation, and they're doing some really good things at early years to engage young people. And the British Council published the Next Generation report, and it said 48% of the participants who participated in the research said if they were better equipped with knowledge around how politics works, then they'll be more likely to participate in politics. And that's, for me, that's the biggest problem. The problem is, it's not that young people don't care about politics. Of course they care about issues that affect them. The problem is whether they see politics and democracy as a vehicle to address those issues that they care about. And the reason why they don't see it as a vehicle as a vehicle to address those issues is because they're not educated about it. So for us, we have to go back down to the civic education. We've started off in the UK under New Labour government in 1997, but it needs to go much further. And then, of course, it needs to be a political engagement package together with votes at 16, together with political education, among other things around voting methods as well.
What are the borders of democracy? Because having referenda in European countries is one of the biggest scares that we have, the image that every country would have to undergo some sort of, you know, stay or leave, would be probably either very adventurous or devastating for the European Union. So where are the borders of democracy? Let me give an example. Let's imagine that we are here one country and that we all decide unanimously that we need an airport, which because every country should have an airport. You can't have a country without an airport and a flag. So we all vote democratically, yes, we want an airport. Now the second decision is on whose backyard shall we build it? And it has to be on one of yours backyards because that's the way the cookie crumbles. Should I, as a, let's say, Prime Minister, give that second question to the public as well? Well, here I'm risking that if I do that, you'll start sooner or later hating each other, throwing stones, and maybe even start a war. If I decide it's going to be yours, I'm sorry, just because, you know, yeah, you will hate me, but that's it. there will be peace among the people, and you'll be hating me with impotent hate because you'll be slamming your beer in the pub saying that I'm an idiot, and you'll be absolutely right, but you won't really physically assault me because we have... So, in a way, first step was legitimately democratic. The second one is dubious. It's better if you hate me collectively as a politician than when... So where exactly are the borders of democracy? Do you have a clear-cut opinion about that?
I thought you were following up on him, but...
Okay, so I'll give you breathing time. You look like you have an answer, so...
Yeah, so I think the problem is when you have a referendum, there has to be stuff that has to complement it. So you have to educate people to know what they are voting on, but also you need to have a sophisticated referendum that is not just a binary yes or no question. So I'll give you the example of New Zealand. In New Zealand, they had a referendum to change the electoral system. The first question was, do you want to change the electoral system? The second question was, people said yes. The second question was, out of this list, which one do you prefer? The third question was, are you sure you want to go ahead with that question, that one that you just picked? And the fourth question was, in a generation's time, in 15 years' time, do you want another referendum to evaluate basically whether it's working well or not? And that's a much more sophisticated way of having a referendum. So I think for me, if you are going to have a referendum, number one key thing is you have to educate people about what they are voting for. I mean, one thing in the UK was, and just to highlight, I'm not here to say, my position representing My Life, My Say, and the APPG is to say we've accepted Brexit. For us, it's about securing a better Brexit for young people. But the problem is that wherever we go, whether it's Portsmouth, Blackburn, Burnley, all these highly voting areas, places where their voices are marginalised, they will tell you that they had no idea what they were voting for because you called a referendum 3 months before. No one knew what the European Union was doing anyway, like in the UK, and I guess that's probably the same thing, and that's something that the EU has to take on board, as well as national governments, to relay the messages of what the EU is doing in terms of its social impact value, etc. But I guess the number one key thing is making sure that people know what they're voting for, and for that you need to allow time to educate them, and also have a more sophisticated referendum. So it's not just a binary yes, no, are we leaving, yes? Because as you said, you end up with a situation where now people are just eating into each other, and there's no way to actually resolve it.
Right. But it's an irony, isn't it? I mean, United Kingdom for me was always the country of education. It has 2 or 3 or 4 best universities that we have in England, and also this happened, I mean, in Europe, and this also happened in the time when transparency in education is cheapest possible because of the internet. Everybody could go within, let's say, 5 minutes, find enough material to decide. I even have this suspicion that when people were, I would say 10% of the population, please correct me, it's just my pub estimate, that some people, I believe, were voting leave as in let the foreigners leave, and remain as in they should remain. I mean, that's the only reason how I could explain all these sort of outbursts of hate days after saying you're still here. So I think the misunderstanding, even perhaps with some part of the population, went to the degree of, do you want them to stay or leave? And they say, oh, stay or leave.
Yeah, I mean, I take your point, but I think it's more to do with there was a lot of concerns around immigration, and that comes down to, if you go to a lot of places like Northern England or Southwest of England, there are a lot of problems, as in, job insecurity, just to give you some statistics, the average first-time buyer in London spends £420,000 on a new property. The average first-time buyer in London needs £106,000 in deposit. The average first-time buyer in London is 39, yeah? More than 60% of Londoners who rent in London spend more than half their income just on rent. So there's 7 million people in work poverty in the United Kingdom. So they're working, but they're still in poverty, yeah? So this is just some of the problems, and I'm talking to you about London specifically, so you can imagine the impact in other areas. So I guess where the immigration and the migration issue comes is that where there are problems, people felt when they voted to leave, and I might be wrong on this, our report is coming out on the 18th of October, and Next Generation report you know, some sort of touches on it as well, so do have a look at that. But some people voted to leave because they felt that migration added to the problem, so they couldn't find a house because there was a lot of people from Eastern Europe coming, or they couldn't find a job because there was a lot of people from European countries coming, or they couldn't get benefits, welfare, because people from all over Europe was coming and they was taking benefits. Or the NHS, there was big waiting times in hospitals because people from Europe was coming and taking up things. So that's where it comes to. But again, that's pretty much stirred up a little bit by the media, and politicians in the UK obviously wanted decisions to go their way.
How was it looking in Africa? How was your vantage point view from Zimbabwe look like?
I think for me also, even as a women's rights activist, probably just coming back to the question that you asked earlier to say about young people and democracy, is that when we're looking at democracy, when we're looking at young people, when we're looking at all these things that we're gathered here to talk about, even considering the previous session, to say what is it that needs to be done. I think for me, what is important is to look at what have we done. What have we done to bring us where we are now? And the key issues for me is when I'm looking at Africa, I'm looking at the democracy, I'm looking at the patterns from colonialism to the liberation struggle to the present day youths, and realizing that when our forefathers or our people who went to war, they went to war, they had an agenda, they had the vision of a new country, for instance, a new Zimbabwe that they wanted, and the youths during that time had clarity of what they wanted as well. And we're in an era where we have a lot of authoritarianism from the people who want independence. For instance, in the case of Zimbabwe, where we have the ruling party that's been ruling for the last 37 years, they are the ones who got us they got us into the liberation, and they are the ones now that are holding us at ransom. And for Zimbabwe right now, we have 90% youth unemployment. And you look at that and you're saying the same almost could be said for South Africa. And you look at that fact and you say, when people went to war, they went to war for a reason, to liberate themselves, to get jobs, to have better institutionalism, to have government work, accountability. And then now you look at what is there and you ask a youth to go and vote. For instance, in Zimbabwe, we have forthcoming elections. You tell a young person to go and register to vote. And we have a ruling party that's been there for 37 years. We have the biggest opposition party that's been also there in the peripheries for the 17 years with the same leader since 2009. Since 1999, the same leader of the opposition party, that's Morgan Tsvangirai. And now he's 17 years leading his own party. And he's been also a prime minister in the government of national unity since 2009, and he's been tried. And so you're going to elections where the ruling party and the biggest opposition party, where young people feel like they've been failed. So the questions become, what is democracy and how do young people view democracy? How are young people's issues addressed in democracy? As a women's rights activist, I'm looking at how are the women's issues addressed in the democracy? And I'm looking at issues like women are more than 52% of the population that's supposed to be voting. And working with young people, with young women, I realized that in my country, for instance, there is no culture of young women participation in public spaces, and that could be said for a lot of countries as well. And so for me, it's about reviewing, revisiting how we have approached democracy, even as practitioners, to say, where have we placed the biggest voters or the biggest populations, like the 52%, for instance, in my case, of Zimbabwean women? Where are they? Are they educated in State? Are they educated? Do they know what's going on? In my past experience, I've seen that young women don't participate in public life. They are not informed. And at some point in their life, maybe when they're in their late 30s, when they've gained a bit of independence as citizens, that's when they begin to go and vote. But who are they voting for? Are they aware of the issues? Do they know what democracy is? So just to say a bit.
All right, well, we have our first question here because we are as interactive as it gets, which means we have a window on Facebook. And you can ask your questions in case you're shy-ish.
And I'll read them out loud in this deep voice. So the first question comes from Maria Alejandra Garcia. Now, this is a classical question, and I'm going to spike it up a little bit. Are democracy and capitalism inherently linked? Question number one. If so, when youth become disappointed with capitalist system, do they, by default, become disappointed with democracy as well? This is a great question. And let me just spike it up by saying that I think we've been exporting market capitalism or democratic capitalism, that's the way we call our system for lack of a better word. And I think we've managed to export capitalism out of the two really well. With democracy, I'm not so sure. You might be sitting in one of the few regions, meaning Central Europe, where democracy was exported in the last 30 years successfully. So when it comes to capitalism, I think that's spread really, really well. So we, let's say, westernized the East when it comes to China, Russia, and Africa and other places. But when it comes to democracy, I have this hunch that there you rather see Easternization of the West, if you take my meaning. Democracy is supposed to elect your best person, and America got a good one this time. But you can see the link between business people and sort of saving politics. So I even sort of, and I'm going to end here and leave you time to answer, but I even think that we are so disappointed with sort of the usual democracy that we vote for business people who sort of don't talk about democracy, but they talk about business. A government should be business-like, and in businesses we all know the democracy is sort of optional. I mean, if you have a good boss, he or she occasionally will sort of perform some sort of, rituals with hands, but how often does that happen in work? Okay, enough of me. Is democracy and capitalism linked, and in which are we more successful as sort of Europeans? So who hasn't spoken for a long time? Susanna, you seem to have a lot of notes.
I don't have any notes,
Okay.
but I think it's a great question, and I do think that there are natural links between the two in a sense that you may see both of them as giving you free choice, or so to speak.
But what about China? China's sort of capitalistic, but not democratic in our sort of way of understanding it.
Right, so it doesn't necessarily go hand in hand, but if I go to the previous question on like why they are linked and why the decrease in, let's say, young people, majority of Americans who are found to distrust capitalism, right? And you also do see that there's a distrust in institutions. But what I think, it's not necessarily, both of them are not necessarily linked in this matter, like one doesn't lead to another. I think young people are just more aware of the causes or of the repercussions, like inequalities. I think it is a discussion that's been ongoing and it's been wide, that young people now are very fearful of their futures. When you look at what Mette was talking about, housing crisis for young people, when you talk about the rise of non-standard employment, when you talk about high youth unemployment around the world, I think those are also causes of that people associate with free market. And so I do believe that young people now want to see a bit more of redistribution, more fairness, and I would end right there.
All right. Your thoughts. Thank you.
Well, I actually believe on the contrary, because I think that capitalism and democracy, they are both projects of modernity, but they're not interrelated necessarily, because democracy is about emancipation of human beings, and capitalism is mostly about domination. If I have to say generally, it's the domination of nature, domination of human beings, and I think that most of the time when we're talking about, and the problem is actually many people like John Dewey or others, they already talked about big business being a problem for democratization of democracies. And I think that when we're talking about democracies, like Mete was talking about, he said we have nothing against politics as young people. I think it's about the art of organizing a society. When we're saying we're defending democracy, we're fighting in the name of democracy, means that we want to organize a society in the best way possible. But the problem is that we cannot do that without democratic passion. We cannot do that without civic virtue. We cannot do that. And these are the problems that actually we're facing today in many democracies. And actually the young people are facing it because there is a fatigue of democracy, especially in relation with market economy, especially with big businesses controlling many things, and especially in many places with the lack of, I would say, public education or civic education, bringing young people not to be too skeptical about politics and politicians. I mean, there is a huge, and that's why we put the title Uncertain Times. There is a huge uncertainty about politics and politicians today, and we see it in the elections everywhere. In the French elections, actually, in the first round, 30% of the young people voted for Mélenchon, who's the extreme left. 25%, 24% voted for Marine Le Pen. So there is actually, in many places in Western Europe, there is a huge skepticism about politicians and about politics. And if there has to be, and I relate here to what Martin Luther King Jr. used to say about democracy. He said democracy should not be thin paper, it should be thick action. Now, for young people today, the only thing that democracy is not in Western Europe is thick action, is only thin paper, because you have representative democracy with delegates, and they ask you to go and vote for them, and they don't know why they're voting for them. And in the other parts of the world, actually, democracy is emancipation, because when Iranians, when the Chinese, when people in Russia and elsewhere, they're fighting in the name of democracy, is democracy as emancipation, as an emancipative program and project. And that's where capitalism and democracy are not necessarily related.
Yeah.
Can I just pick up on the last point about the mistrust or distrust for the politicians? If you look at, again, the British Council's Next Generation report, so the majority of young people that they spoke to said that they don't trust politicians, and for a lot of reasons, yeah? So like in the case of the UK, it could be because of the expenses scandal, or it could be because of many other reasons. But yet 73% of them believe that it's important that young people... 73% of them believe that it's important that young people do engage in politics. So they do believe that young people want to be engaged, like they should be engaged, but they don't trust the politicians. But one of the interesting angles that I want to bring to your question, and I guess I don't want to touch too much upon the sort of the politics of it, but it's about how business can also work with government and civil society to engage with young people in politics. So in the run-up to the 2017 general election, My Life, My Say, we teamed up with an organisation called Bite the Ballot, which is a voter registration organisation in the UK. And what we done was, one of the things that we're really passionate about is rather than creating a space where you bring young people to, and you call them young My Life, My Say members, what we do is identify places where young people go to in their day-to-day, social and digital lives. So I come from a footballing background where I used to be a scout for Arsenal and for Southampton. One of the things we do is we work with football clubs and community foundations because they work with hundreds and thousands of young people from disadvantaged backgrounds, girls and boys. So how do we get our message across to them rather than trying to bring them to us? The second thing we've done is working with digital partners. So we worked with Uber. So whilst you was waiting for your taxi, within that 3 minutes, you got a message to say, can you register to vote? Tinder. Whilst you're swiping left or right, you got a message to say, have you registered to vote? So I guess what we could think about is as well, and a question for us to go forward, again, when we're thinking about engaging young people, is how do we, this isn't just a role for government. How do government, civil society, young people, as well as business and others, work together to actually engage more young people in politics?
I have an excellent question that fits right here from Kevin Hanley. Hello to Kevin, wherever he may be. If not democracy, what do young people want? I think this is a tough one. Are you ready to answer the call?
Yeah, I think I'll share from the African point of view.
Yeah.
Young people feel let down by democracy because
they're done with democracy?
They feel let down. They feel like it's not incorporating what they want. Democracy isn't incorporating the young people's views and their interests. And one of the things that has been sprouting up in Africa a lot is the issue of protests. Young people feel like over and above, well, I don't feel also that it's a one-size-fits-all, like they want to completely be done with democracy. I feel like young people want democracy to be revisited. That's why political parties have to have young people.
What do you mean by democracy revisited?
So the prototype, or maybe as I said earlier on, that the way we do democracy. For instance, when we're voting for when we're engaging in democracy right now, a young person has to choose probably a political party that they're going to, they feel is incorporating their own views. So now, if that political party is, for instance, chosen into power, the political party isn't necessarily doing what the young people want done. For instance, I vote for MDC. I put MDC into power today. There are high chances that MDC is not going to do what us as young people want. They are probably not going to follow through on their promises. So what do we do as young people to have our issues addressed? We go to the streets and protest. We use social media to protest. We use other tools like that. So I've been seeing that young people are resorting more to protest over and above not probably going to vote. They're staying at home, they're not voting, but they're also engaging in protests.
Yeah.
Just now, in Venezuela, the people, for example, doesn't have a special working on democracy, or we have a special fight in democracy, but the people is not educated on democracy, because just now, for example, we have more than 3 million people eating from the trash. So the people is looking for food before thinking in another thing to do. Just now, we were an example of democracy for more than 40 years, and just now we are a country of a very sad situation because of the communism. And I want to relate with the past answer because just now I think that the capitalism or socialism are not only the sign of the way that may a government take to the country. I think that in the way that the government put all the very what to say this, when the government use the social plans or applies better economic plans, the country may improve the situation. For example, just now I'm living in Spain, and Spain has a socialist governor, as Felipe González. He has been here some minutes ago, and he has been 13 years governing a country before the capitalism arrives to the modern world. And it's an example of how a country may improve their situation after 40 years of the civil war at Spain. In Venezuela, for example, the socialism of the 21st century, that, as Hugo Chavez says, starts with some way of socialism, but just now it's communism. So it now depends only on the name of the plan, but it's very important to define correct the meaning of socialism or capitalism, because it may change between the situations.
So, if not democracy, what do young people want?
Well, I think that Kevin's question is a very good question, but the answer to it is a very simple answer, actually, because I think that the young people, they want social justice, they want self-respect, they want jobs, they want change. I mean, these are all things which come up, actually. And the problem is that
Populism could secure those. Do you think?
populism is securing it. That's why we have rise of populism everywhere, because in the name of populism, actually, they come and they say, we give you dignity, we give you self-respect, we give you jobs, and populist regimes have always been like that. I mean, their slogans have been around. Okay, we give you respect, we give you dignity, we give you jobs, and some kind of a social justice. I mean, of course, they never provided absolutely. And we have to see there actually a kind of a fatigue of representative democracy or liberal democracy, which cannot provide it. And I just want to add one thing. You know, there was a Eurobarometer in France, Italy, and Poland, and everywhere it was under 50% that young people, 42%, 43% in Italy and in France, that young people found democracy convincing as a regime. Why is it under 50%? Because they find, I mean, this is where we have the rise of populisms, in discourse, but also in action. They give them, they would say, well, we're going to provide you with everything you want, and mostly with your ideal. And if democracy is not functioning anymore as an ideal, I think that there is a fatigue of democracy.
Fatigue? Are the young people tired? Are they fatigued with?
Are we fatigued?
And what do they?
I think we are frustrated.
Okay.
I think what we need, and I love that my colleague said revisiting democracy. This is what we need. It is not necessarily finding a different model. Let's look at just statistics. If we see that if young people under 30, half of the population, 15 to 24, 1.2 billion. Yet when you look at our politicians, who's representing us, who's giving us, who's deciding about us, young parliamentarians under 30, less than 2% in the world. I mean, we want to be a part of the solution, yet we are being spoken about as a part of the problem. And I think what's also necessary is to include young people, and not only in questions about education. And I think this is really old. You know, when we talk about young people, it's school. But young people is also access to healthcare in the United Kingdom, in the United States, a big concern. It's also questions about transportation, about housing, as we said. So they need to be a part of the process of developing the national strategies.
Well, what does this have to do with democracy? Whether you have a job or not, it's got nothing to do with a patronizing state, whether you can transport yourself, I mean...
Right, when you talk about then...
isn't that already expecting a little bit too much care from the government?
No, I don't think so, because, you know, I do think that the way that we understand democracy is different than from what our older generations understand.
Right.
Of course, then there is a lot of... I actually looked up how people felt after the fall of the Berlin Wall, which will be exactly 28 years, 1 month from now.
Right.
Because I was not born here. I was not present. And there is this discussion of euphoria, of hope, of this moral legitimacy the democracies had, right, as a supreme system. When you look at young people, and this is not their fault, they haven't lived through it, they understand it as more a stability. They go beyond. They take it as maybe for granted, that's sure. But then when, as we said, the future doesn't look all that great for them, they may start questioning the system.
So democracy seems to look sexy when you don't have her.
It's like a toy.
Once you do,
it's like when you lose a toy. When you have the toy, you don't want it, and then when someone takes it, you fight for it.
Well, last year we had a similar topic, right? And the advertisement instead of the sort of energy bomb that we had today was an inscription on the wall which said, "I miss how much I was loved," and it was signed democracy. And I remember this being slightly older. I lived through '89. And yeah, the first 2 years were vibrating. It was just unbelievable. Everybody, we had a goal, we knew where we are going. A lot of things went wrong, but we had a thrust, we had a pull. Now it seems, and I blame philosophers, that we have no new, strategy, the sort of humanism or even democracy doesn't seem to have a roadmap.
That's the fake action that Martin Luther King talks about.
Exactly.
Democracy as fake action.
How will democracy look like 20 years from now? Because today democracies are, by the way, linked to the national state. This is something that it's so obvious we tend to skip it. We have referenda that are nation-based. I think maybe in 20 years we'll have global referenda. What sort of questions will we be solving as mankind? And these sort of visions, I think, this is my thesis, that democracy is not disappointing, but we have nowhere freedom is a beginning, not an end. And we have this freedom, but we don't know where to go. So anyway, that's just my slight provocation there. Now, another question comes from Rebecca. We seem to have really good questions today. Rebecca Duras is asking, how does one measure youth disagreement or disengagement from democracy? Do we have, maybe this is a good question for you, do we have some sort of a measurement or data to measure disengagement? Are low voting rates synonymous with distrust in democracy? So we have also a classical question. People who don't vote doesn't mean that they're so happy with the system, they don't bother, or are they so madly angry with the system that they sort of think that they're giving a protest voice? But there is no such thing as a protest voice. If you don't go voting, you're voting nevertheless. You just gave your voice to the people who do. So if I'd be the only one who goes to elections and the rest of the 10 million people would not go, I would decide, the nation would delegate their choice upon the one that goes voting. So can we measure this? You use the word fatigue many times, and I like the word fatigue. I think we are tired of being the good guy. I think this is exactly, Trump isn't really a populist as much as he is a, how to put it politely? He is presenting himself as a mean person. That is the difference. He actually, I'm quite sure he gave some money to charity somewhere along his life, but it would be completely unfit of him to in any way boast it, because his image is the guy who no longer, who represents a fatigue of being the nice guy. We no longer want to be the nice guy. We want to be a little bit mean. We don't care about you. We care about us first. So again, how do you measure disengagement?
I mean,
we have two politologists,
I will just say a few words. It's good that you take the example of Donald Trump. I mean, if you're a young person in America, and to put it very politely, I mean, you're quite an intelligent person, and you see your president who's unintelligent. I use it very politely. And why unintelligent? Because young people today, for example, they're very much concerned by the climate change. They're very much concerned by some questions which are typically questions of our time, the global challenges. And you see that your representatives in Europe and around the world and in America, they are not concerned at all with these kind of questions. So you think twice, and you get, should I have civic engagement or civic disengagement? Do they take care of us or not? Do they care about us going and voting or wanting change? Well, apparently this is not the case. And so I think that this is where the fatigue of democracy comes, because the gap between the wishes and what the young people are asking for the future generations, and what we're living today at the level of politicians and politics and decision making, at the level of economy and politics, is a huge gap, a huge gap. So that's why in many elections, the young people are turning towards extreme right or extreme left. In many places in Europe, because they say, well, we think that liberal democracy is not working for us, and they are not answering our challenges, they are not answering our questions. So that's how you have civic disengagement.
Because it seems to me that there are two ways of how you can take democracy. Some leaders, for example Trump, take democracy as a means of getting to power, and that's pretty much it. Yes. Otherwise it's a bother and nuisance and it's too much talking. And then there is another understanding of democracy, which is trying to find the best decision in the room under the assumption that more people will know more and that logic will correct the decision. That is, to me, democracy. Now, answer this riddle. We live in an age where it's the easiest to engage oneself in public affairs. It's very easy to start an NGO. It's very easy to, you've all done it. And it's even easier to be close to the decision-making of your politicians. And there's never been a time in the world where politics would read the lips of the polis as much as even to a little bit too much, we sometimes say. Yeah, don't read the lips, you should have a vision, etc., etc., etc. Why is it in our time and age, where we have the closest link to our politicians, the politicians are really, listening. So what do you want? What do you want? Let me give you what, but I don't know what you want. We have elections here in 2 weeks, and my most favorite poster is a certain lady whose name I shan't say, and she says, "I want exactly what you want." And I thought that's, you're basically skipping the whole, whatever, housing and security, and no, I want exactly what you want. Give me your voice, and I'm gonna get you what you think you want. Now, so again, the riddle that we, in fact, in reality, are the closest to politics that we have ever been. You can actually really stop building of a highway for very, very petite reasons. It's why is it that people feel disentangled, disengaged, and overlooked, when in fact, I would argue exactly the opposite is the case?
So, I mean, in the case of the UK, and I'm going to quote again the Next Generation report, but 54% of young people don't believe that what's being discussed in British politics represents the issues that they care about. So you can clearly see that, again, they don't see the mainstream politicians.
85, you said?
No, 54%.
54, okay, good.
Yeah, and if you look at those data even more detailed, there's even...
Right.
Yeah. So again, the problem is where you have, when you say politics to a young person, especially in the UK, you think Westminster, Parliament, MPs, but you don't think about, whether actually politics is about whether your train service is running on time, or whether your recycling bag's getting picked up in front of your home. Or I was doing this workshop once with a group of 15 to 17-year-old students, and one of the students identified Pokemon Go as a technological trend. I asked him, "Do you care about politics?" And he said, "No." And I said to him, "What's on the news about Pokemon Go at the moment?" And he didn't know, so someone else said, "They might share your location with the government." I said, "How do you feel about that?" He said, "I don't want the government to know where I am." And then someone else said, "Actually, if they knew where I was, then it's good in case something happened to me." And I go, that's politics for you. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, if you don't do politics, politics will do you. I used to hate the idea of when people used to say, if you don't vote, don't complain. However, over the years of doing the work I do, especially since the last election, I know that because we've turned out in a large number, I now have regular meetings every month with the Department for Exiting the EU, which is the Brexit department of the government, because they now feel like they have to engage with us. So what I would say is, and again, I just want to come on to a previous point as well, participation and how representation is really important. So I got elected at the age of 21. Does anyone want to guess, or do you want to guess what the average age of a councillor is in the UK?
61.
66.
66?
Yeah. When I got,
that must include dead people.
When I first got elected, I got an email, I never forget, and it said invitation to a young councillors network by the local government association. I thought, great, I'm going to meet people who, because I was only 21 at the time, I didn't know, like what to expect and how to hold public office, and I looked at the age criteria, and it was 48 and below, and I thought, well, that's not really helpful, is it? So I guess the problem for us is, again, when we talk about how do we engage, we need to look at what the barriers are. So going back to what you said about understanding where we are. So do we have representation? No. The answer is no. And not just in terms of young people, because when we talk about young people, we forget women, we forget ethnic minorities, we forget young people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, we forget young people with disabilities, you forget the LGBT community. There's so many different types of groups, and our politics and the chambers that represent us have to represent that. Otherwise, what happens is you get a group of, I'm sorry to say this as well, but you get a group of old white men who come down and say, how can we help you? First thing is, you should change, that's how you help. So like I said to you, is if you don't do politics, politics will do you, so definitely do keep engaged in politics.
Yep, please. Thank you.
I think I want to address the question that you asked earlier, of the young person that asked, is democracy synonymous with figures that go to vote? Was it something like that?
You mean democracy and capitalism?
No, the one after.
Oh, disengagement.
Yeah, disengagement.
How does one measure disengagement? Is that this one?
Yeah. So was the person relating it to democracy?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think for me, what is important for all of us to realize is that young people are not a homogeneous group, like he just said. And so to that question, I'll say yes and no. Yes, in the sense that yes, young people or the key populations can decide to stay away from going to participate in public life, be it registering to vote or actually voting itself, or airing their views or letting their issues known. So in that sense, it can be a sign of we are not interested or we don't have options. Like for the situation in Zimbabwe right now, which we're faced with as we're building up to the next year's elections. Young people are saying, young people and women and even men are saying, we don't have options. Why should I go and register to vote? Because I don't support the ruling party. I don't like the opposition party. So who am I going to, why should I register to vote, and why should I vote? I don't have a candidate on the list. So those are some of the questions. So we are having to answer the question to say, hey, it's still your right to go and register to vote. In case something, maybe somebody comes on the scene that you don't want to not have that option to vote. So that answers the yes part of, yes, people can stay away from participating in democratic processes, like electoral processes, because they are not happy. But it can also be a no, simply because for a long time in Zimbabwe, between probably 1980 and in the year 2000, when the ruling party was still the darling of the country, when Mugabe was still liked, people simply didn't go to vote. Nobody went to vote because they were content. They're like, oh, well, we like the existing political party. We don't have to go and vote. We don't want to contest, you know. So between 1980 and maybe around 1998, thereabout, people, women, nobody really spoke about, hey, let's go and vote. So in that sense, maybe it was, it's a no. When people don't go and register to vote, probably it could mean content with the existing. But another issue that I think that has been addressed is we need to revisit what we call democracy. What is democracy to Zimbabwe may not be democracy to the United States or to South Africa. And also the distortion of democracy by those who've run before it. So therefore, when young people are looking at democracy or evaluating democracy, we need to go back to the drawing board to say, what is our understanding of democracy? But who has used democracy so much that people don't want anything to do with democracy?
Mm-hmm. Right. So, of course, you have not used your voice, so you're welcome to. And I'll just read two questions that seem to be more answers, perhaps, than questions. And again, I salute both of the people who asked. So first is Sarah Melissa Chiline. So she's saying, according to a recent poll, only 37% of high school students believe that democracy is the best form of government. The next generation of leaders should try to make the world a better place, but why do they not believe that democracy is the ideal route? How do we maintain democracy without these young people? What is the role of education? We already spoke about that in the development of, or destruction of society. Question number one. Question number two is very similar, comes from Evgen Harant. Number of recent papers and studies show that millennials have become more, quote, more cynical about the value of democracy as a political system, end of quote, as well as, quote, more willing to express support for authoritarian alternatives, something that you spoke about, end of quote. However, recent events imply that situation is maybe less alarming. Namely, US millennials voted in far greater numbers for Hillary Clinton than Donald Trump, as did majority of Americans. But the problem is that too many of them did not vote at all. So the question is, whether we face democratic indifference, this is what you spoke, whether this indifference isn't maybe one of the greatest luxuries that we have. So the question is whether we face democratic indifference, disengagement from politics, or public life, or both. And what should we do to change this tendency? So there's this fatigue. 57% of people is pretty good for this part of the world. But yeah, any thoughts on that, Zuzka?
Just about the US elections, actually, it is not true that younger people voted less than in previous years. It's been fairly stable, and it is not true, it is true that young people voted more for Hillary Clinton. But when you look at the disaggregate data, you see very big change among the young voters who voted during the recent elections and then in 2012. When Obama was elected, you do see that certain groups of young people were voting more for Donald Trump. And those would be people from rural areas, white men, less educated young people. So you do see that it's stratified, and it's very hard to then generalize about young people. But when it comes to the disengagements, and it comes back to the question on how do we measure it, you know, yes, voter turnout among young people is one of the indicators. Then you have the trust in institutions, and you have also, if we talk about democracy as empowering people, the belief that you can change something. And this rate of belief is so low. In the Czech Republic, 7 out of 10 young people think that they cannot change what's happening around them.
But don't you see that being a kind of a conundrum where they actually can? I mean, they couldn't during communism. They couldn't during kingships and other, and now they can, and people feel they can't, which to me is a puzzle.
I wonder if it's because we are so set on having everything fast that, you know, and democracy takes time.
Right.
And we need to really nurture it, and we need to be a bit patient. But I also do think that we do need to turn out to vote more. And the one thing is, I do not believe young people are necessarily disengaged. They find novel and unconventional ways of participating. So it would be protesting. It would be going on social media, sharing content, liking candidates, commenting on candidates, signing online petitions, going vegan. However much you don't like it, or you know, whatever your opinion on it. There are ways that we engage, that we show our opinions, big companies, boycotting them. But it is not enough. And this is something I try to tell students, that we do need to show up to go and vote.
Just on that point, because I think it raises an important point about accessibility. So again, yeah, so around accessibility for our democracy, I think one of the problems that we have, as well as representation and education, is about how accessible our democracy is in terms of traditional terms. So in the UK, for example, when you vote, it's a working day, it's on a Thursday. So nowadays, we live in a different type of era where when you work, it's not from 9 to 5. People work shifts from 8 to 8 or different times. And you know, there might not, and you have to go back to your local polling station. So there are so many barriers. So I think we can look at what we can do is maybe we can introduce online voting. I don't know, maybe it's a possibility. If you could trust your finances on your mobile app, why can't you trust your vote? Maybe. The other thing we could look at doing in the case of the UK is whether we could change the election to make it a public holiday or change it to a weekend. Or in the UK, we don't even have an online register where you can check if you're registered to vote. It's absolutely like, it's mind-blowing how we live in an age where we've got so much technology and we don't use it to our advantage. And sometimes I feel like...
Don't you feel after, the meddling of American elections that, you know, going back to paper is actually, you know, not such a bad idea?
So I agree. However, the same arguments that you can use against online voting can also be used against postal voting. So in the UK, we have postal voting.
Now, you have to explain that.
So postal voting is, you register for postal voting 2 weeks before you get your polling card, yeah, and you can X who you vote for, you put it in the post and you send it off. Who knows what happens to your vote?
Right.
I don't know if it's received, who's checked it, I don't know. So the same argument, and you know, the arguments they use against online voting is, for example, peer pressure, safety, all these sort of things, but the same arguments can also be applied for postal voting. I'm sure if they invested enough, I'm not saying online voting is the answer, but what I'm saying is where we live in a digital age, why not?
I will be asking all of you towards the end 3 things if you could change about the way we do democracy if you had a magic band. So I think that would be great to, so we have 1 now, but each one of you have 3 things, practical things that you would change. Change the age group, change whatever.
Okay.
Yeah. So let's keep that towards, because there's wonderful. There's a bulk of questions regarding how we should reform it. Now, please. Now, actually, do we need a mic? Or you can whisper into my microphone.
It's basically a response and a question to Susanna and Basil, where you mentioned how if you don't do democracy does you, and using social media to engage and be an activist. At the same time, as we've seen with the headline of the elections in the United States and throughout Europe, social media also will impact. So what do we do in terms of
To be done well. Right.
When I was a child in the United States in the 70s and 80s, bathed in advertising all the time. Part of school was learning how advertising lies to you. It does not become a part of education in countries throughout Europe.
Good point. I hope everybody heard. Would you like to take it?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, just briefly, I think that's a very good point. Again, you know, like through the Next Generation report, 68% of young people said that they get their news from social media. But I guess part of the reason for that is because where you have mainstream media, which is can be so sort of ideologically driven to push people a certain way, then what happens is people look at it and then think, well, I'm not going to trust their views, so they go on social media and then take it from there. So I guess the problem is maybe we need to look at reforming how the media is run, and so it's not so much ideology driven, or how accessible the mainstream media is to young people as well. So I think that's another question to answer, which could take probably hours to go through.
Right.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for the question. I would just add that media literacy these days is absolutely crucial in schools, teaching young kids that this is what you read. You should always think twice about it. And in fact, it is true that young people these days consume news from social media. Less so, young people don't own TV these days. It's not a thing. Radio, not a thing. Forget about it. So we really need to be careful about giving them the tool to understand. And I think, yes, media plays a role. We should also make sure that it is free and fair media like out there. But it is a very good point that the social media can also be detrimental to democracy.
I want to add something here. I think we need to, since Forum 2000 is a global forum, it's not only about the Western world, we need to distinguish here between the role of the social media in the process of democratization in the Western world, which is mainly we're talking about voting or not voting, and the struggle for democracy in many other countries of the world, like in China, Iran, we saw it with the Arab Spring. In 2009 in Iran, actually, the social media, we talked about the Twitter revolution, you know, or YouTube revolution. In the Arab Spring, again, it played a very important role in Egypt and everywhere else. So I think that when we're actually talking about democracy here, we have to distinguish between what I call the fatigue of democracy in the West. But this fatigue does not exist necessarily in other parts of the world. In many places where democracy is a struggle for emancipation, it's still a very strong ideal for people. I see in this room we have opponents to the Iranian regime sitting here, but we have also some Venezuelans and people who are against the regime and are fighting in the name of democracy. If you go and ask them why do they fight, in the name of what they are fighting, they would say, we are Democrats, and we are fighting in the name of democracy. So the passion for democracy is there. But when we go back to the Western Europe or something to the Trumpization of politics, I call it. Yeah. I call it the Trumpization of politics. There is kind of an uncertainty, there's kind of a doubt, there's kind of a fatigue there. And the Americans and the French and the Germans and Austrians and maybe Eastern European, Czechs and others, they're asking questions.
Central Europeans.
Yeah, Central Europeans also, I refer to the Poles and others. They're asking questions about themselves and about what they have achieved until now and otherwise.
No, the example of Poland is a great example, or Hungary, or Czech Republic. But Poland, to me, most strikingly, was sort of a very sort of lively country that I thought politics was a little bit ahead of the economy, which is exactly the other way around here. But in 2 weeks, the whole atmosphere changed from a very open Sikorsky government to a very sort of, now they're having, I don't know whether you noticed, they're having a prayer chain around Poland, praying against Islam, and I'm quite sure feminism and all the multiculti things. And that happened to a nation that was standing pretty strong. Now even the Christians are becoming nationalist, respecting the borders. That is fundamentally against the whole idea of Christianity. What happened? I even thought that something happened in the year 2015. The whole world was beautiful, and 10 years ago the sky was blue, and we didn't have a problem. And then something happened towards the end of 2015. I connected, of course, with Star Wars Force Awakens, which also came up in December 2015. And it seemed to me that, yeah, some force somehow awoke. It was an evil force. Suddenly there was this, I also enjoy it in the terms of fatigue of goodness. And the world suddenly became evil. We were, in 2015, we were welcoming the refugees literally with mattresses, and then something went wrong, and as if some gate was opened, because I love conspiracy theories. There's a wonderful conspiracy theory about Paddock already, by the way, if you want to watch the Bradbond news. It's the left, it was a leftish conspiracy shooting at people who are most likely to like guns, which is clearly country song goers, because the link there is obvious. And it was a leftish plot to ban firearms. That's your 2-day summary of conspiracies. Yeah, I think we also have this conspiracy that, you know, the EU is after Britain, and we have this conspiracy that the world is after Americans, and the conspiracy of the right, I only understood yesterday, is that the world wants to disarm them. That's why everybody should have a rifle, because the left should not be allowed to disarm you thusly. So, welcome to the disarmed world already. Okay, we have a couple of more. We have actually 20 more minutes, so this would be a perfect time for you to come in. 20 or 15. And if not, I'd like to ask one more question.
I actually have a question.
Oh, sorry.
I'm here.
Oh, yeah, sorry, yeah.
On the right, yeah.
Can you, whoever you are, stand? Yes, please, thank you.
Hello.
Wonderful.
My question relates to what you talked about earlier, about young people participating in democracy, but not just by going to vote, but by being elected themselves. And I wanted to ask all of you, what are the major problems? Why don't young people participate this way more, and what solutions could possibly be there for this?
So why don't the younger people engage more now that they can? They don't have to do it via politics, they can do it via their own, I call it sort of a hipster method. Huh? Yeah.
So thank you for the question. I think something that you mentioned that's profound is the issue of young people coming on the front themselves to be leaders. And I would say that we've been seeing that happening in Zimbabwe currently, where more young women are coming in on the political front to be elected as leaders, to pronounce themselves as members of parliament or contesting in their own constituencies. And of course, we know that there's a lot of violence. That's one other reason that young people don't want to participate in elections. Sometimes the intimidation of the environments, the not so democratic processes, lack of transparency in the electoral processes themselves. But there's been young people coming in, but as independent candidates, because as I said, in Zimbabwe right now, many people feel like we don't have good options. So the young people that are coming on the front are coming on as independent candidates, and I do feel like they are engaging the current young people, they're engaging in the current issues that's affecting young people. So it is exciting for young people, but also realizing that they're against a machinery, if I can say. For instance, in the case of Zimbabwe again, where the ruling party is basically part of the government itself, like they've infiltrated the government departments themselves. So when you're coming as a contestant, you have a lot at stake. You have so much to fight against, including what we have known as rigging in Zimbabwe. That's been on the cards for a long time. So we remain optimistic, but yeah, those are some of the issues.
I just ate my eraser. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
I used to do it when I was
Yeah, when let me be a little bit brutal here, okay, if I can. When I was young, we had anarchists, we had punks, we had hippies. What do you have now? What sort of a movement, except for hipster bio-eating, is there among the youth? What do you care for?
Well, you have Occupy Wall Street.
That wasn't young. I mean, in every generation, as far as we remember, every young had a revolt against something, from anarchy through communists, through I don't know what. Now we don't seem to have that.
I think
people tweet,
we need to
and you establish Facebook groups, and
we need to be more optimistic. I think there are
you don't seem to be
especially with the rise of Trumpization of politics. I would say there are new social movements, what we call the new social movements in the West, and there is a new democratic thought actually shaping itself, not only in America but also in Europe. So we need to be certainly more optimistic about young people trying, if not voting, I mean, they're trying to experience new modes of democratic thought or democratic action, as in NGOs, student movements. Take, for example, India. I mean, student movement in India is actually, many students are fighting against the Hindu right, but they're doing it at the universities.
You want me to wait in?
Can I just quick,
just real quick, because we got 3 questions now. People got really
and
going.
this is something for the panel and for everyone here as well. When we talk about young people and what do young people want, I always find that that question a bit problematic, because, as I said before, there's so many different intersectionalities within young people. There's a difference between teenagers and...
But there doesn't seem to be a movement of any kind.
Yeah, but maybe it's because there isn't so many, and again, I'm coming from the European and the thing perspective, but we have that now with Brexit. And that's what's created this movement of, I mean, my organization, we've had an uptake of like 11,000 people face-to-face that we've worked in 2017, just alone, face-to-face, because of Brexit. So sometimes maybe you need that big issue, but the question is then, do you want the big issue to happen? Because then there's problems.
Yeah,
Okay, just really briefly.
Okay. I think that's also one of the things that we identified recently in Zimbabwe, that I think whereas we're comparing with the Mugabe regime, where they had, for instance, they wanted liberation. We seem not to have. I think we've identified that even as young people in Zimbabwe, that there is need for the young people to define the big goal, the big vision. What is it that we want to run with?
And we shouldn't forget that maybe the most important and the loudest member of this panel is missing.
Yeah. China.
Yeah. There you could see the agenda is clear, but I lack an agenda for the West, let me say. Please.
I'd just like to make a comment about, as an American and as a child of the 60s who grew up in the Civil Rights Movement and the Vietnam War and came from a family of activists and learned that through my education, I'm sorry that we don't have any American young person activists participating here today. I think that we had many, many years of complacency where the young people grew up just taking everything for granted. And now they recognize we have a crisis in our country, not dissimilar from what's going on in the rest of the world. Right. And so to have representation from our young people, to get the civic education and young people to start to understand that each person has an obligation to participate in their community in some way, is the only hope. And I think it's education, and I'm sorry that we don't have a representation here.
Yeah. All right. Thank you for that. Sorry. And then next mic goes to a lady here in the third row. And if we have a spare, oh, perfect. Yeah, there you go. You're getting one. And please.
Hello, my name is Anna, and I'm from Slovakia. And similarly to other countries, we have many inactive young people. And also there is this issue with young people voting extremists and non-traditional parties. But on the other hand, we have a whole mini universe of active students and caring students. Guess what they have done? They have organized marches about against corruption, and their aim was to put attention on the biggest corruption cases which are connected to the politicians. They also created petition, and when it will reach certain amount of signs, the parliament will have to discuss and interrogate high-level politicians connected to the biggest corruption cases. We can say that there is a certain power in youth. Also, the Velvet Revolution was started by students. But once the students finally started some action about issue that bothers majority of citizens in Slovakia, but no one is willing or everyone is scared or lazy to do anything about it, strange thing happened. Older people turned back and pointed fingers at the youth. They started to believe conspiracies, how the students were paid by the third parties or some opposition, and also they convicted them as naive and stupid.
Right. Now, shorten it up a little
And
bit, darling.
finally, the question is, how can we make the change in the world when older people do not believe in us? Also, I do not tell that every old person do not believe in youth, but how to make older people to believe in youth and don't convict us as naive, but as like motivated and willing to change things for better. Thank you. Sorry that this question had a long intro.
No problem, no problem. And you have...
I think that two questions are related, and it goes back to the idea of leadership in democracies. Actually, the lady from America, she was referring to the civil rights movement in the 1960s. We had great leaders at the time, which were not only political leaders, but they were moral leaders. And people were looking up to them, like Martin Luther King Jr., even Malcolm X, and you had many other people. And today, what's missing, actually, is that we have many social movements done by students, done by young people, but there is no leadership which comes up and uplifts others in spirit, you know? So everybody is equal and there is no leadership. And of course, on the side of the politicians, we have also a failure of leadership. So we're actually living in a time where there is an absence, total absence of leadership, and we don't have a moral compass to guide us in today's political world or economic world.
Which again comes to me blaming us, thinkers and philosophers. Because it seems like a little bit like at the end of the Catholic era, at the end of medieval time, but there is no Luther, so to speak. Everybody is pregnant with expecting a little bit of revisiting, maybe refreshing of democracy, but there doesn't seem to be a leader. Yeah. Do you wanted to say something?
Yeah,
and then we have a
I just wanted to give an example about how to promote intergenerational dialogue, because one of the things that happened with Brexit is that you had a lot of older people who voted to leave, and you had overwhelmingly 75% of young people voted to remain. So one of the things that we're doing, just to give you an example with My Life, My Say, is we run something called Democracy Cafe or Brexit Cafe, which works with Starbucks. And we bring together 30, 40 young people together in a coffee shop environment, aimed to reignite the 17th century discussing politics over coffee. And again, the reason why we do it there is because if you have an event in a place like this, people have to worry about wearing a suit, or they have to worry about feeling intimidated if they say something. So if we're trying to reach young people from underrepresented communities, we need to go to where they are. So one of the things that we're doing with the intergenerational dialogue is bringing together older people and younger people through these Brexit cafes to get them to try to understand why they both voted the way they did, and more crucially, how can we build a Brexit going together, working together with both generations.
Coffee, that's also novelty. When I was young, they used to give us tea.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just really quickly, there are certain comments or questions regarding why young people do not go into politics, and then how we could make, how we could earn more respect. And actually, I have, when I speak to some politicians, I ask them, we need more young people in politics. They will say they don't have the experience. But to be honest, in this time when a failed, bankrupted businessman can become the leader of the free world, give me a break.
Yeah, good point. Good point.
Let's give young people the benefit of a doubt, and also politics is not about having the experience necessarily. Politics is also about igniting civic participation among your constituencies. It's about bringing people together, working together, and young people want to work with other people as well. It's just that we are either always, whenever there's a panel, youth panel, it's always young people, so I welcome you both. But also, when you notice just the audience here, it is mostly now young people, so we're, a lot of time.
They take it as a compliment, everybody.
Right, but we had a bigger crowd in the last panel.
Yeah.
And so this is something I've also experienced at the UN when we spoke. Whenever it was youth issues, young people came in, older people came out. So it needs to be about us and about you, about other generations, but with each other.
There's actually a really interesting trend, which I call, B2B is business to business, as you all know, but there's a new market called baby to baby, in which babies directly cater to babies. This is maybe, the Czech blogger Míšovy šílenosti, who has 42 million clicks. Karel Gott, which is another famous Czech singer, has 9 million clicks. And always in the past, things for kids were made by adults, stories, toys, and now there is a new market which caters babies. 7-year-old child, shoots a little video directly to his 7-year-old peer somewhere out there. So this sort of getting rid of the middleman, which is usually a man, white male around 40s, getting rid of that seems to be quite general. Now we have time for last questions, and then we have these 3 ideas. What do you want? Yeah, so hippies wanted love, anarchists wanted peace of mind. Now, what do you want?
Hi, my name is Anna Zamec, and I'm originally from Poland, and I'm actually an NGO program manager and a freelance journalist. Yeah. Thank you for this very important and timely panel. I think it's an excellent question, the title of this panel today. We've heard a lot of complaints, we've heard a lot of concerns that young people do not go to vote, young people are not engaged in politics. At the same time, there is no viable representation, in fact, for young people. The existing parties do not represent the interest of young people well. My question is, perhaps the solution could be to establish this representation, to establish a new party of young people. We've heard that politics is not only about experience, but politics is first of all about engagement. Yeah. So perhaps it's time for a new movement, for a new party. I know it's harder in Great Britain because of the first past the post system. Yeah. The electoral system does not really leave much space for a new formation. But how about other countries? And my point here, there's a new movement that has been established right now across Europe, a pan-European movement called Vox. We will see it will take off the ground. There's no funding really, but this is a party that is supposed to represent young people and give voice to the young people who are pan-European, who represent certain democratic liberal values. At the same time, of course, they're in different countries. They have also their
when pensioners have their own parties, why can't the young people have?
Right. So my question is, I would like to hear your thoughts on this idea. Does such a party actually have a chance of succeeding?
That actually is an easy question for us Czechs, because we do have a party called the Pirates. They are very popular with the youth, and they most likely will get into the parliament. So this will be a big, I think the answer to your question will come selfly in half a year. Okay, we have 2 last minutes. If I do my math right, you have each 20 seconds to give me all the solutions for the future of democracy. Go ahead, Daniel.
First, promote reference to follow around the world, I say. when you have
So more referenda?
Promote reference, do laws in which the young people had necessarily to be part of political parties, for example.
So decrease the age of voting?
Yeah.
Okay.
And
third?
Promote 2 laws in which the people will, at the parties need more young people at the structure of the parties.
Okay, thank you.
Mine is the belief that for us to change democracy, we need to engage young women at a very young age.
How?
And make sure that they are part of public life, encouraging public life participation of young women at a very young age. And secondly...
So that was your first magic wand wish?
Yes. And secondly, ensuring that political parties have values of democracy within their political parties, including issues of equal representation of women.
Okay.
And then thirdly, allowing that when we are working, for instance, I work in Africa, and usually most of the funding comes from Europe or from the West. When we are coming with the funding, let's sit together, let's have the voices and let the locals come up with the solutions. Let's not come up with the ideas from here and then come with them to Zimbabwe and then call for applications for proposals. Let's create the programs together.
Okay. Grassroots.
To fundraise.
Makes sense, and that would also solve maybe people getting more easily engaged. When
Exactly, because they have ownership of the programs.
Right. Yep, thank you very much.
The first one is citizenship education, so strengthening the citizenship education if you do have one, or if you don't, then to create a new political education to educate people about democracy. The second one is making democracy more accessible, so looking at new forms of like whether it's online voting, changing voting methods, etc. And then the third one is to have a National Democracy Week to celebrate democracy and to have specific targeted campaigns during that week towards different groups. So it could be for women one day, it could be for young people one day, it could be for ethnic minorities one day, but a way to basically celebrate our democracy and to create a buzz, and preferably at a time which is in the run-up to a deadline of an election.
And yeah, good, thank you.
I think that the only way democracy will have a future in our world would be with democratic passion and the promotion of the art of questioning.
Wonderful, wonderful. See, H speaks very concisely. Susanna, you will be the last but one. I suggest we should give the last word to Joshua, but the last spoken word is yours.
Thank you. I will have my 3.
Have your 3.
I won't be as concise, sorry. I will, I agree with the civic education, but I would also add that it needs to be discussion-based. So not only principles of democracy, what it is, why it's important, but engage with the people.
So imply democratic procedures into the very structure of education.
And that as well, and not only educate on the level of education, but also locally, so engage them in, for example, there's participatory budgeting, which young people can decide how money is spent on the local level. So that's show them that their power can have an impact. Okay. And this can be also on the schools level through school parliaments.
So that was your first wish?
There was 1 and 2, but yes, of course. Then I'll add more. Then also include youth in, as I said, national development strategies and issues that directly affect them, and those are cross-sectoral. So I'll keep this short. And the last one, if you wish, youth quotas. However much we don't like quotas, but for example, in party politics, it's important to engage young people from the early age.
Okay, thank you very much. And the last word, it's sometimes silence that speaks the loudest. Joshua, what do you think? What would be 3 things if you could wish? 3 movements of the magic wand. What do you want? Wonk. And with that, I wish you a very good rest of the day. Thank you very much for being wonderful panelists. Thank you. Thank you very much.